They have total contempt for us in their totally implausible defense of Biden. That's why this is serious. That's why it's not funny. That's why every time this happens, we need to increase the volume of our outrage. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Steve Hilton Show. We got a great, substance-rich show today. I think I want to put it like that. A great conversation with Susan Shelley coming up that gets into the really outrageous stuff that's going on in California right now with respect to the ballot initiatives that are coming up and the budget, all sorts of detail, and also a really important ruling from the Ninth Circuit, which is usually very bad. In terms of where it comes down on things, a really important ruling that has national implications potentially in terms of the vaccine mandate and a lawsuit that's been going on brought by people who are fired as a result of the outrageous vaccine mandate, which was never justified by the science. You've heard me talk about that for years with people like Jay Bhattacharya. There's been a really important ruling on that, and we get into that with Susan Shelley. But first, I want to start with this flurry of stories once again about Biden's total incapacity for the job he has, let alone the job he wants to have. And it's just a set of things have built up. A couple of these when I was away. There was an interview in Time magazine, and they published the transcript of the interview. And it's just absolutely shocking. I mean, this is the guy who is claiming to be the president. You can't imagine how he can actually be the president. I mean, he's just rambling on in this interview. The interview is mainly about foreign policy, which is supposed to be the thing he really knows about. That was how he was sold to us, Biden. Oh, the great foreign policy expert, the great genius of foreign policy. He was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and all the rest of it. By the way, Robert Gates always said he's been wrong on every single major foreign policy and security question for the last, was it 30 years? I can't remember the time frame, but it's not that he's wrong in this interview on things. It's just that it's totally incoherent. It's hard to even make out what he thinks. If you read the transcript, it is really worrying that this guy is supposedly in charge of the world's leading nation and wants to do it for another 4 years. He clearly is not capable of doing it. And this interview transcript in Time magazine is one of the worst examples so far. And just to pick out a few of the things, he just loses his train of thought in terms of what the argument he's trying to make on issue after issue. He muddles things up, muddles countries up. I mean, he did that again in public this week. Was it when he was over in France for the D-Day commemorations? He kind of muddles up Iraq and Ukraine. Easy to do. I mean, for goodness sake, he forgets the name of the Warsaw Pact. Sort of mumbles about the alternative to NATO. I mean, okay, fine, losing his memory, but it's not good enough. And this is what I want to say. If you combine it with the other thing that we saw last week, which is reporting in the Wall Street Journal, vigorously denied by the White House, of course, but there's a very, very well-sourced article from the news side of the Wall Street Journal, independent from the editorial part of the newspaper, which is, clearly has a conservative disposition. This is just news reporting from multiple sources who just say that in meetings, Biden is just all over the place. Some days he can function, other days he can barely speak in meetings and in the White House. And this is what I've been saying all along. Like, imagine if this is when we see these videos, and they're now a daily occurrence, every single time Biden is out in public, it's an absolute catastrophe. He forgets things. He muddles things up. He can't speak. I mean, I'm taping this on Tuesday morning. I don't know when you're going to listen to it, Tuesday, June the 11th, when you'll be hearing this, just last night in the White House, where he froze for an uncomfortably long period. It was painful to watch during some celebration. So every single time he's out in public now, by the time you listen to this, there'll probably be another one of him doing something absolutely appallingly embarrassing. And sometimes you can laugh about it because it's actually funny, and other times it's not funny. It's just incredibly serious because this guy is supposed to be in charge. Right, the Wall Street Journal piece. And I always say, imagine when we watch these videos, imagine if that's what he's like in public when he knows he's on display and the cameras are trained on him. And he's kind of, you would imagine, trying to keep it together. Imagine what he's like in private when he's not on display And that's what we pick up in this Wall Street Journal piece, the inside accounts of what he's like in meetings, reading from note cards in meetings where he's supposed to be in charge, running the meeting and directing the agenda, big negotiations, meetings with people from Congress and other parts of the government. I mean, on and on. It's just so terrible. It's devastating. Then you add to it, the polling is just out, and he's now got the lowest approval rating of any president in history, the lowest number on any of the measures, when you aggregate the measures. And it's not funny. It's really serious in two different ways. First of all, in the most important way for any patriot, anyone who loves our country and cares about the future of our country and the role that we play in the world, this is terrifying. It's not a joke. It's not just gaffes. It's not just mumbling and stumbling and whatever. It's all true, but it's much more serious than that when you have someone who is just incapable of doing the job. He is senile. He is gaga. He has totally lost it. He is incapable of being an effective commander-in-chief, president of the United States. He cannot do the job now, let alone for another 4 years. And that is an absolutely terrifying prospect. This is why the 25th Amendment was put into the Constitution. It should be used right now by anyone with an ounce of decency or patriotism who is around Biden, anyone in his cabinet. They should be using the 25th Amendment now to get this senile old fool out of the White House. It is outrageous that he is there. It is a danger to the world that he is there. He needs to be removed. And actually, when you look at his deterioration and the fact that it gets worse day by day, week by week, and people say, well, you've got the election coming up. I don't know, can we afford to have him there with the conflicts that are going on around the world, these incredibly dangerous situations? Can you even risk another few months of this guy in the White House? I don't think so. I think he needs to be removed right now. That is one serious part of it, the most serious for any patriot, anyone who loves this country. It is incredibly serious, and this guy needs to be removed, let alone trying to be re-elected for another 4 years. But here's the second thing that is incredibly serious about all this, and it's really something that affects the Democratic Party specifically. They all know this. They all know this. The people that are cited in the Wall Street Journal article, many of them are Democrats, not just Republicans. They know what's going on. And yet, they are still maintaining this total fiction that somehow this wizened, senile, decrepit mediocrity, Biden, can still be the president and is the best choice that they could put forward to the American people at the election in a few months' time to lead the country for another 4 years. They're still running around saying that. What absolute contempt for all of us that shows. They treat us with contempt every time they lie. Of course, it's a lie when they go out and say Biden's fine and can do the job. They're lying. They know the reason I use the word lying is because they know he can't, but they're saying he can anyway. They are lying. And the fact that they're lying about something so important shows their contempt for us. These people that endlessly lecture us about our democracy and democratic norms and all the rest of it, they have total contempt for us in their totally implausible defense of Biden. That's why this is serious. That's why it's not funny. That's why every time this happens, we need to increase the volume of our outrage at the fact that the Democratic Party is still insisting that this appalling man, who for all his career has stood for nothing, done nothing except climb his way up the ladder, he's always been a corrupt machine politician mediocrity. And now on top of all that, a senile one as well. He has to go. So I want to talk now about a policy paper that we've just put out at my organization, Golden Together. And for me, it's one of the most important things that we can focus on, but it's hardly ever focused on, actually. In many ways, the subject that I'm going to talk about is the underlying foundational cause of so many of the other problems that we end up talking about in policy and in politics. Taxes and the size of government and crime and welfare and addiction and homelessness and all these kind of social problems, right? They make up, and economic ones as well, and the schools and what's going on in schools and unemployment and earnings and people's qualifications and the future of the economy, and all these things, right? they are what we talk about all the time. And we talk about how we solve these problems, right? How do we solve the problem of crime? How do we solve the problem of people falling into drug addiction, ending up on the streets? How do we solve the problem of, what's going on in the schools and kids aren't educated properly and then they don't have enough opportunities in life, and that can lead them into welfare dependency, and that costs us money, and that increases the size of government and the budget, and then our taxes go up, and then we become less competitive, and our businesses suffer. All these things are connected, right? There's this set of problems, social and economic problems, and we discuss solutions to them. How do we fix these problems? But actually, what we never do is talk about the underlying cause. We talk about the symptoms, right? The symptoms of social and economic problems. We don't talk about the cause. And that's what this policy paper does. And so often, and this is not just my opinion, this is now backed up, although, I would say it is pretty common sense. And actually, if you think about it for a minute, I think you'd all agree it's pretty obvious and common sense. But it's also now backed up by years and years of research and advances in many, many fields of science and research, including neuroscience and developmental healthcare and all sorts of things that have really put data and real evidence behind what I think most of us would agree, that actually the cause, the origin of so many of these things that we think of as social problems, economic problems, it goes right back to the home, to the family, to the way kids are raised. Because the truth is that if we could conceive and imagine and then see in reality a society where every child is raised in a stable, loving home that gives them the opportunities to fulfill their potential and flourish, then so many of these other social problems would just disappear. We wouldn't have a crime problem to the extent that we do. We wouldn't have addiction and welfare dependence and all these things to the extent that we do. If we can do something early on to stop kids growing up in a way that gets them off on the wrong track, that causes problems down the line, that costs the government, and in the end, obviously, us taxpayers down the line. Wouldn't that be so much better? It would save a lot of pain and suffering, and frankly, it would save us a lot of money. So that's the idea of the paper that we're talking about. And there's two simple phrases actually that are in the paper. One of them is prevention is better than cure. And that's really what this policy paper is all about. But there's another one, which is a more evocative, beautiful statement. It's actually on the front cover of our document. I'll read it to you now. It's a quote you may have heard. It's from Frederick Douglass. It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. So that is the idea that underpins this policy paper. And the actual title of it is Parent Empowerment and Home Visiting, a human way to fight poverty, strengthen families, and improve life chances. Now, you can read it on our website, goldentogether.com. I'll try and give you a brief summary of it because it's something I've worked on for many, many years. Back in the day when I was working in the UK government as senior advisor to Prime Minister David Cameron, this is one of the real priorities for me, was this set of issues around how children are raised. Because it turns out that actually, if you look at what really drives up, even if you look at it as I point out in the paper, you could look at this from a more conservative point of view, with conservative goals in mind, which are all about reducing the size of government and the scope of government, and reducing the cost of government, right? Whether you look at it from that point of view, or you look at it from the point of view of terms that a liberal might use, for example, building a more just society. Like either way, it turns out that so much of this happens really early in life. And that's partly to do with the way the brain develops. A lot of the brain pathways that actually create the patterns of behavior and the way that you approach life later on, they're set in the early years of life, in the first few years of life. And actually, even early in that, often the first few days and weeks and months of life, it really sets the course. And so what you have right now is a situation where in so many homes, particularly now we have this high incidence, and we've talked about this in other conversations. For example, not long ago in one of the episodes of the Big Ideas Book Club, we talk about the fact that it's not just family breakdown where couples come together and they have children, then they break up and there's divorce and separation. Actually, increasingly, parents don't even get together to raise children in the first place. And so you've got a lot more stress and instability in the home, in families, and that can lead directly to the kind of problems we see later in life that end up costing us a fortune. And again, if you just care about it from a conservative point of view, end up costing you in taxes because we've allowed these problems to grow. And often it's actually a relatively small number of people and families and children who end up having the most problems and causing the most problems. And so some people might just look at all that and say, well, that's just life. What can we do about it? There's nothing really you can do. And the way children are raised is just, just bad luck, and some families, they're going to be chaotic and dysfunctional, and that's just nothing you can do about it. That is actually just simply not true. It's not true based on the facts and the evidence and stories we can tell and projects we can see of where we've made a real positive difference to families, but also just in principle, we shouldn't just give up. Just as we, when we see crime plaguing our cities and our communities, we don't just sort of give up and say, well, yeah, people are going to be bad, nothing you can do about it. No, we try and fight crime. And in the same way, I think we can and should do more to fight the kind of dysfunction early in life that can lead to problems later in life. And so that's the focus of this paper. And there have been a number of initiatives, some of them run by nonprofits and faith groups, others run, for example, in the UK through the National Health Service, where actually you've had really good results from trained and trusted individuals, not a government bureaucracy, handing out, welfare checks or whatever, but actual real hands-on practical help in the home. This is the crucial part, where you have someone who's trusted. It could be someone who works for a faith organization or a nurse, for example, who's trusted and trained to do this, who goes into the home, especially in the early years, the early days, weeks and months of life when a child is born. And parents often these days, I know there's a ton of information out there and, you can watch videos online and read books and everything, but it's not the same as having someone there by your side helping you. Now, in previous generations, that may have been someone in your family, it could be your grandparent or someone, in your immediate family circle. But our families are much more atomized these days and people move away. And so it's not the same as it used to be. People live in separate places. And so actually a lot of the time you have new parents, new mothers, new fathers feel very isolated and don't know what to do. And if they themselves are living in really tough circumstances, if they live in poverty or they live in a neighborhood that's poor and there's crime going on and there's chaos all around them, it's really, really hard to raise a child the right way, the way that will set them up for success later in life. So we can't just give up on that. There are things that we can do to help that. And that's what we talk about in this paper. And it's a combination of really coaching parents. That's the word I use in this paper, to give you a coach that can help you. And you may think this is all, ridiculously obvious and simple, but it's really not. I'll give you one example. So it's actually, very clear. And anyone who's been a parent will know this. One of the most stressful things about being a new parent is when a baby won't sleep and you can't get them to sleep, and then you're awake all night, and then it's a nightmare and everyone's kind of in a bad mood and stressed out because no one's had enough sleep. There's a really good data now that shows that one of the most frequent kind of periods when couples, whether they're married or not, break up and a family breaks down is in the first year after a new child is born, because it's so stressful. And sleep deprivation drives a lot of that, right? You're totally stressed out. You haven't had enough sleep. A small argument can turn into a massive disagreement and break up a couple. That's very frequent. There are practical things you can do to avoid that. For example, if you learn how to put a baby down properly to sleep, if you learn about feeding properly so that they're full and they sleep more, they're more likely to sleep through the night quicker so that you get more rest. All of these practical things. Again, you could say, well, everyone should know that. It should be obvious. It's really not obvious, right? You need help. Everyone could do with help. Everyone. And so what we're proposing in this paper is a system where we can get that kind of hands-on practical help into the home so that there's someone there showing people how to do it, helping them, answering their questions, just in a hands-on way, empowering the parents to do what we would all aspire to, which is to be the kind of parent that creates a stable, loving home for children so that they go on to lead confident and flourishing lives that mean that they just have they proceed through life without ever having to create a demand on the government through some kind of corrective or remedial action that ends up costing taxpayers. So here's the sort of final thing I'd say about this. I know some people may be skeptical of this and say, well, why should we be doing all this and whatever? Like, here's the way to think about it. Conservatives often say, we need to cut government, right? Less government, lower taxes, less government. Agreed. I totally agree with that. You know that I do. But here's the thing. If you think about it like market economics, supply and demand. So what we're talking about when we say things like less government, lower taxes, is reducing the supply of government, right? We need less of it, reducing the supply. But actually, the only long-term sustainable way to reduce the supply of government is if we reduce the demand for government, if we actually reduce the things that cause government to grow in the first place. And that is social problems of the kind that we've been talking about here. So that's our policy paper. Please check it out. Go to goldentogether.com and let me know what you think. All right, joining us now for California Corner, Susan Shelley. Susan, you've got a couple of really meaty stories for us today. One of them is on what's going on with bonds in California. Bonds, of course, really means tax increases, which they love. We'll get to that in a second. But first, there was a really interesting ruling on the vaccine mandate in Los Angeles. Tell us what happened there.
Well, the Los Angeles Unified School District passed a vaccine mandate for its employees in March of 2021 and said you'll get the vaccine or you're fired. And many people were fired. Well, there was a lawsuit filed by the employees, and the district manipulated what their vaccine was, what their mandate was, in order to sort of fool the courts. And they did this several times. They played cat and mouse. They said, well, it's not really a mandate because you can get tested instead of getting the vaccine. But then they pulled that. After they got what they wanted from the court, where a lawsuit was dropped, they pulled that and they imposed the mandate again. So another lawsuit was filed. And it all wound up at the Ninth Circuit. The lower court dismissed the lawsuit, saying that they cited a case from 1905, Jacobson versus Massachusetts in 1905, which involved the smallpox vaccine. And what the court said then is the government has the power to protect the public health to impose a vaccine that prevents transmission of smallpox.
Right.
Well, the situation with the COVID vaccine is not quite the same because it doesn't prevent transmission.
Exactly.
And so at this stage of the proceedings in the Ninth Circuit, they were looking at that and they decided they would overrule the lower court because the plaintiffs, the employees who were fired, presented evidence that the vaccine does not prevent transmission. And the school district could have challenged that with a stack of studies, if they had them, showing that it does prevent transmission, but they didn't have anything. They had a flyer from the CDC that said safe and effective, and that's all they had. So essentially what happened is the court was willing to take judicial notice of anything they had. They didn't have anything. So the court said the Jacobson case does not apply. And that could be very significant because many times when these mandates have been imposed, the Jacobson case from 1905 from smallpox has been cited as allowing the government to impose a vaccine mandate. What the Ninth Circuit said is this is a violation of your medical freedom. It's a violation of your bodily integrity, and it's a violation of substantive due process. It's essentially battery on people to force them to take a vaccine in order to keep their jobs. So this is very significant. The LAUSD, the district, wanted the court to say that the case is moot, that it's over, that there's no mandate right now.
Yeah.
But interestingly, the court said, well, you can put it back whenever you want to, and you've been showing that you will. As soon as you get what you want in the courts, you put the mandate right back again. And so for that reason, we're sending it back to the lower court to be reconsidered on the correct legal standard. So this is very interesting, and this could be important in the future because we're not rid of this idea that the government is going to do these mRNA vaccines and force them on everyone.
So let me just get into a couple of the aspects here. First of all, just to reiterate the central point here, which is the vaccine doesn't prevent transmission, and further, it was never even designed to prevent trans. It's not like it was ineffective or failed or whatever. That's not what it was designed to do. So I mean, I remember reporting on this at the time and going on and on about it with Jay Bhattacharya and others, like even the emergency use authorization or whatever the thing is that they had to go through doesn't even talk about transmission. It's nothing. It wasn't ever even the Pfizer and all the rest of them. They never argued that it would prevent transmission. So it's the whole transmission thing is a complete nonsense, right, from the beginning.
Right.
Now, on this particular one, is this ruling, first of all, just on the legal process and where we are in that? I've seen in some of the reporting around this from left-leaning media have said, well, this was a panel of the Ninth Circuit, and I think it was 3 judges, 2-1, right? And they said,
Right.
well, both of the 2 were Trump-appointed judges. So does that make any difference? If it's a small panel, does it mean it doesn't really have as much weight, or is that just a kind of completely ridiculous political point?
Well, in any case that goes to the Ninth Circuit, it goes to a 3-judge panel, and then if you don't like the ruling, you can appeal for what's called an en banc or en banc, where you get 11 judges to review it, and they can turn that down, or they can agree to do it, and they can review the decision if they think it's wrong, and then if you don't like it again, you can appeal to the United States Supreme Court. But interestingly, there was a case out of Brooklyn in 2020 where Governor Cuomo at the time had imposed this red, orange, yellow attendance limitations on churches, but not on what he considered essential businesses. So liquor stores didn't have these restrictions, but churches did. And there was a lawsuit over it. And the same thing, the government of New York was pulling the red designation and saying, oh, well, the case is moot because this isn't in effect anymore. Well, the Supreme Court said that's not good enough and struck down the red, orange, whatever it was. But concurring in the opinion, Justice Neil Gorsuch, also appointed by Donald Trump, said this is not right. You can't stand down on these things when the Constitution is under attack. The court can't shelter in place and refuse to decide these things, saying it's moot. They could put it back whenever they wanted to. And it's not enough to say that the plaintiffs can refile and sue again, because that's a tremendous burden on people. Even if the court takes it up quickly, that's a tremendous burden. So the whole idea that you can have a government emergency and the Constitution does not apply is wrong. And he said so. The court said so at the beginning of that decision. There is no emergency exception to the First Amendment, which it protects the free exercise of religion. There's no emergency exception to the entire Constitution. It's in effect all the time. War, peace, pandemic, health, it's in effect all the time. And it isn't right to say, oh, we've withdrawn the mandate and now you can't sue. We're going to get your suit dismissed. People have invested all this time and money and effort in the lawsuit, and you're going to make them refile every time you reimpose it. So that's really what the Ninth Circuit said, is that LAUSD doesn't deserve the benefit of the doubt because they've been playing games. They even played some of the recording from an LAUSD board meeting where the Board of Education was saying, well, we're going to get sued if we do this, but I don't care. And they were discussing the litigation as a basis for whether they would or wouldn't impose the mandate. And that was just too much for the Ninth Circuit. And whether they're appointed by Donald Trump or anybody else, the Constitution is the Constitution.
Got it.
And everybody should be cognizant of that.
So, the second question on this, how narrowly drawn is it about vaccine mandates? Is it vaccine mandates specifically, health mandates a bit broader? What does this apply to that looking ahead, we could be confident now that the government can't arbitrarily impose things here in California on us?
Well, this is pretty narrow. This particular decision sends the lawsuit by the employees back to the lower court to be determined under the right standard. So this does not apply to everything they're doing. However, if LAUSD appeals this decision and it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, we might get a very broad decision about what they can and can't do and how many times they can withdraw it before it's just cat and mouse game.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we'll watch that. But it's, as you say, very significant and a great victory. I mean, that was one of the most egregious things. I mean, there were so many terrible things in the pandemic, but that was really, it was such nonsense. It was based on nothing, and you're forcing people, and things like forcing kids to have it before, and otherwise they couldn't go to school. Absolutely disgraceful. Let's turn to the second topic, this bond issue. Bond, not an issue of a bond, but the topic of what's going on with ACA1, this ballot initiative. Tell us what's the latest.
Well, when California was originally becoming a state in 1849, in the gold rush era, actually before it was a state, it had a handwritten constitution. And one of the provisions in the handwritten constitution warned that the legislature must be careful to protect the people of each municipality, each town and city from excessive debt. This is the responsibility of the legislature to prevent the people from excessive local debt for whatever reason. In 1879, this became codified into a two-thirds requirement for local bonds to be approved.
18 what was the year?
1879.
1879. Amazing. Okay.
Yeah, by now the Constitution is typeset. It's not handwritten, but it goes back that far that local bonds must pass with a two-thirds vote to protect the people from excessive debt. Because it's very tempting. Anybody can experience that. Running up the credit cards is fun. But to protect the people for the next 30 years from excessive debt from politicians, a two-thirds vote of the people was necessary to put a municipality, a school district, a transit district, whatever, into debt. Two-thirds vote. Well, from that day to this, that's been the law in California. But last fall, the legislature, in its infinite wisdom, passed ACA 1, which is a constitutional amendment. It's on the ballot this November. And it says that we're cutting it down to 55% instead of 66.7%. Bonds will pass with only 55% if they're for infrastructure or affordable housing. Very broadly defined. So it's almost everything. So local governments would be able to put local bonds on the ballot for housing, for transit, for anything they wanted that sounded great that they thought the voters would go for. They could put it on the ballot and people could vote for more and more and more debt, and it would pass with 55%.
Yes, because basically a bond, just to be clear, we've talked about this before. I mean, it's a tax increase that's actually higher than a tax increase because you're borrowing the money, you have to pay it back with interest.
Yes, and one more thing about local bonds is that they're paid for by property owners. That goes on the property tax bills. So
Right,
everybody
right,
votes, but only property owners pay. And so
right,
that's a
right.
big concern.
Just out of interest, why is that? Why wouldn't it, for example, or why couldn't it go on local sales tax that is more broadly just based?
Well, that's a good question. And ACA 1 also would knock down the threshold for local special taxes to 55%. It's currently at two-thirds for local special taxes. That's a tax for a specific purpose, as opposed to a general tax that just goes into the general fund and the government decides how to spend it. When you have special taxes, which are interestingly, in a way, easier to pass because people don't trust the government's spending decisions. So you have to tell people, well, we're raising your taxes, but we're going to do it for this. So sales taxes and other types of taxes would pass, business taxes, parcel taxes would pass with 55% under ACA 1. So why is it that only property owners pay local bonds? I'm not really sure what the history of that is, but I would imagine it's because it has to be secured against something. If you're going to go out and sell bonds, it has to be secured against something, and the property tax roll is probably how they did that.
Couple of questions. The statewide bonds, like we just saw with Prop 1, that squeaked through, that was a bond, whatever,
Right.
6 billion, again, is that going to give 12 billion by the time you pay the interest. For, you know, the claim that it would help with homelessness, obviously we've been through why it won't, um, just got through. That was a 50%, right? For a
Right.
statewide. So
Statewide bond,
where's
and
this
that
55 come from?
well, it's the difference between statewide general obligation bonds and local bonds. So a statewide general obligation bond doesn't come with an automatic tax increase. That's paid out of the general fund. So it adds to the debt burden of the state. The state
Right,
has to pay the interest and the principal back, and that's a general obligation bond. But a local bond is different. A local bond goes against the property. So
right.
currently, ever since 1879, that's required a two-thirds vote of the local electorate that's taking on the debt. But now it would be 50, if ACA 1 passes, it would be 55% for all bonds having to do with infrastructure broadly defined, and affordable housing, broadly defined. So that would raise taxes every election.
And why did they pick 55, not 50? Just curious about that.
Well, in 2000, there was a proposition, Prop 39, that did this for school bonds. The idea was that schools are so important that we can't have this two-thirds vote. It's too hard to pass new debt to build new schools, so we have to have it at 55%. So that was sold to the voters, along with a long story about how specific the spending proposals will be and how much oversight there will be, and a lot of other smoke and mirrors like that. And so the voters adopted Prop 39 in 2000, and school bonds pass with 55% in
Right.
California.
Okay.
Right.
Got it.
And so now the idea is, well, if we did it for school bonds, we can do it for
Well,
transit, we
can I
can do
just
it
make
for.
a little observation here? You are the absolute oracle of everything. I mean, I don't think there's a single question I could throw you that you don't have absolutely chapter and verse on. But the final point on this is how it's affecting the dynamics of other things on the ballot this
Yes.
year. Tell us about that.
Well, we have many things on the ballot that the people who want to raise your taxes support or oppose. And all of these battles are going to be rather expensive. So, how many of them will really be on the ballot is what's going on right now. Um, with ACA 1 in the Bay Area, the Bay Area Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the Association of Bay Area Governments and the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority want to put a $20 billion bond on the ballot. And they would
Wow.
like ACA 1 to be, it's to be paid for in 9 counties. It would raise the property taxes in 9 Bay Area counties. They want that on the ballot this fall. They don't think they can get more than 55%, according
Yeah.
to their polling. So they are pushing the legislature to amend ACA 1 to pull it off the ballot, put something else on that takes away the special taxes part of it. That because special taxes would drop from 66.7% threshold to pass down to 55, and that's not polling well. But apparently the bond portion of it they think they can
Oh,
get through.
so interesting.
So they're pushing, take that off, put something else on. Now we also have the Taxpayer Protection Act,
Yeah.
which is a protection for taxpayers. That's from the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. That is currently being challenged by the governor and the legislature in court. They're trying to get it taken off the ballot in court because, once again, that would be a very expensive battle if it's on the ballot in November. But it's fully qualified, and there's no reason to take it off the ballot, in my judgment. But we'll see what happens.
So what happens if taxpayer protection, again, we were just discussing this off air, as it were, and we'll come back once we get that ruling and getting really into it. You've been central to that fight at Howard Jarvis. With what happens if taxpayer protection is on the ballot, as feeling good about that right now, we'll see, and passes, and ACA 1 passes, how do they interact?
Well, that's a good question. There could be some conflicts, but in general, what the Taxpayer Protection Act does is really separate from ACA 1. It requires ballot transparency, um, and it puts back the two-thirds vote for local special taxes that a court decision took away. But ACA 1 is actually an amendment of Prop 13 itself. So that would, I believe, have a great deal of impact because you're changing the Constitution. So the Taxpayer Protection Act would create something new. It would allow voters to pass statewide taxes. Right now, statewide taxes don't require voter approval, but they would for the first time. So that's in the Taxpayer Protection Act. That's not affected by ACA 1. So there could be some conflicts, but many of the things in the Taxpayer Protection Act would be in force without any conflict at
So
all.
does taxpayer protection not cover bonds? Is that the simple way of
It affects, let me see, it affects it in the ballot transparency portion, but in general, I think it's focused on
local
closing
taxes, property taxes and so on?
local taxes, closing that loophole. The state Supreme Court indicated that if a tax increase is put on the ballot by a citizen's initiative, if unions go out and collect signatures for a tax increase that goes to them in higher salaries, that's exempt from the Constitution. They sort of indicated that. So the Taxpayer Protection Act closes that interpretation loophole and says, no, 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 two-thirds means two-thirds. local special taxes needed 2/3 votes. So I don't know how that would exactly interact with ACA 1 because ACA 1 knocks many of these down to 55%. But in any case, there would be no special initiative exemption that knocks it further down to 50%, which is where we are now.
It's so, first of all, an overwhelming sense just in these conversations is just, it's relentless, isn't it? The kind of drive for higher taxes and bigger government, and you just got to, like, it's coming at you from so many different directions in California, state,
Yeah.
local, etc. And there's so much going on. There's so many of these initiatives. It's just hard to keep track of it all, and that's how they get away with it, actually. So it just reinforces my view that complexity is the enemy of good government in so many different ways. This is another example of it. It's interesting, this point about ACA one. So it's so fascinating. So they're worried that they're going to lose their ability to get the bond through because they've kind of overplayed their hand on ACA one. That's
Exactly.
really the issue here. Is they think, well, people like the idea of lowering the threshold when it comes to inverted commas infrastructure and housing because those things sound popular, but not for taxes. But actually, it's all taxes, really. So
Exactly.
that's a sort of distinction without a difference, as they say.
Yes.
What's the timeline on this ACA? What can they just take it off and amend it? I mean, what's the process for that?
It's the same June 27th date that the
Oh, I see.
Secretary of
Okay,
State has given everybody. This is the date that she says she has to have complete decisions on what is on or off the ballot. And so everybody who's negotiating things on or off the ballot or wants to pull something, put something else on, June 27th is the date that that has to be signed and the ink dry on the
really
governor's
interesting.
desk.
We're going to keep close touch on all this. And the other thing, just it reminds us, is this period in the year is such a kind of nightmare, isn't it? Because there's so much going on. All this shenanigans with the ballot. We haven't even talked to you and I about the ballot initiative to reform Prop 47. And then on top of that, you've got the hundreds and hundreds of bills that are just coming through the legislature. With what your conclusion from all of this is that there's this sort of incredible government, just government rolls forward and the machine just churns out stuff, and no one can really kind of grasp it and grip it properly. And you can kind of, slice off a bit of it there and a bit of it there. But like the idea that there's any kind of real accountability here is ridiculous. And so you've got to do something to constrain just the scale of this government activity.
There is more security on a game show than there is in the California budget. You can get the California budget amended at any time during the year with one of these trailer bills, where they take a piece of blank legislation that they passed earlier out of the drawer, amend some enormous law into it that spends just a little bit of money so it can be a budget bill. And then, boom, it goes to the floor for an up or down vote, no policy committee hearings, right to the governor's desk on a rocket, and it's law. And that's how they make energy policy. That's how they make education policy in Sacramento. This is absurd.
We need
And this
massive
also
changes.
absolutely, because there are a lot of rules having to do with time periods to make sure everything is thoughtfully considered, but they are all hacked. They're getting around all of it. And one of the ways they do it is these blank pieces of legislation. They pass that on the timeline, but it's blank, and then they
Yeah.
amend it later. So we have that. We have the gut and amend process where they take a piece of legislation that went through the thoughtful time period and they completely gut all the language in it, replace it with something else. Boom, right to the governor's desk. So this is what happens with a one-party state when
Exactly
you
right.
don't have any checks and balances.
Yeah, exactly. It's so bad. It's so bad. And of course, we see the consequences in all this terrible policy. But that's why we're here to alert people to it and to keep an eye on it. And that's what you do so well. And we appreciate it. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Steve.
All right, everybody, here is something I want to get off my chest, more so than usual, actually. I was so so infuriated by this when I saw it. I want to show you what I saw as I got back home on Sunday from my wonderful vacation in Montana, all kind of chilled out and beautiful Glacier National Park. We had a wonderful time, and and it was fantastic. And then I get home and we get the newspapers delivered in our house. I'm old fashioned like that. And we get the Wall Street Journal and we get the New York Times. And there it was, the Sunday Times, the New York Times on Sunday. And here is the front page of the opinion section of the New York Times this Sunday. I'm going to hold it up. There it is. Right. That's what I saw. Now, it's probably too small for you to read in this copy that I'm waving around. So we'll put it on the screen. Here's what I read from the New York bloody Times. Can we finally have an honest conversation about COVID? Can we finally have an honest conversation about COVID from the people who shut down honest conversations about COVID for years? Literally, they go on and say, the lab leak theory explained, Fauci, Congress, and the fragility of trust. And they go about vaccines and mandates and masks and all the other crap. Can we finally have an honest conversation about COVID? Says the New York Times, who for years, when we tried to tell the truth about COVID, when I reported on the lab leak, not theory, but the fact that this originated in the lab, as I've talked about many times, as a direct result of the research commissioned by Dr. Fauci. And we'd said that, and these bloody people called it a conspiracy theory and said that it shouldn't be discussed and censored anyone who tried to do it. When we pointed out that masks are totally ineffective at blocking the transmission of this airborne virus because the particles are so small they go through, based on the science, which we knew months into the pandemic, not like after the event. We knew that in March, April of the pandemic, they shut it down and said, no, you can't talk about that. That's going to kill lives. You've got blood on your hands. When we said that social distancing is complete crap because it's a different analysis for a different disease that spread through droplets that fall through the eggs. They're heavy and they land in a certain distance from people, whereas this is nothing like that. This is an airborne particle that travels much, much further. So the whole concept of the lockdowns, where stores had to shut down if they couldn't guarantee social distancing, people couldn't go into the office, all this stuff, right, driven by total junk science, not even science, just as Fauci just admitted, it just came from nowhere. When we said that, right, in the early days of the pandemic, these people at the New York Times shut it down. Can we finally have an honest conversation about COVID? Yeah, here's the honest conversation I want to have about COVID. When do we get an apology from the New York Times and all these other people that stopped us having an honest conversation about COVID that could have prevented lives being lost and definitely would have prevented the massive economic and social costs of the lockdowns that they supported? Right, everyone. Well, I need to calm down after that. Glad I got it off my chest. Glad you were with us for that show. Hope you enjoyed it. That is the end of our show for today. Make sure you check out Big Ideas Book Club. There's a really, really amazing episode that you won't want to miss with Callie Means, who's written this fantastic book with his sister Casey Means, Good Energy. I'm sure you've seen it. Lots of people talking about it. It just goes to the heart of this massive, massive issue of, as he puts it, the poisoning of America through industrialized food and the growth of big pharma and the corruption. And it's just an absolutely mind-blowing conversation. I thought I knew about the subject, and I do. I followed it very closely, but I learned so much. So do check out Big Ideas Book Club. And of course, do follow us here on The Steve Hilton Show. Come back for next week's episode. Follow us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next week.